Just top line, the Data Safety Monitoring Board for the DPP study halted the study early because diet and exercise was twice as good as metformin in preventing the progression on to type 2 diabetes. I mean, hands down winner. When you looked into the results, therapeutic lifestyle change, TLC, was also beating metformin for change in weight. And obviously it was changing activity levels in ways that the drug wasn't. Adherence rates to metformin are a little bit tough compared to placebo. You know, I think it's fair to say that the only credible hypothesis for how metformin produces weight loss or weight gain attenuation is via GI distress. Okay, so while psychiatrists trip over themselves to address quality of life in many other aspects of our practice, we're fully prepared to put the guy on metformin and give them some GI distress as a way to shave off the weight gain that we're seeing as an iatrogenic effect. I mean, I'm trying not to be too harsh. Okay, so the mechanism for weight gain is largely, but not entirely, histamine type 1 receptor antagonism. So this is worthy of a recommendation. If the guy's on haloperidol or aripiprazole or ziprasidone, has gone to all that trouble to take a low-risk antipsychotic, and then we can talk about adds in complex polypharmacy or goes down to the corner store and starts using an over-the-counter sleeper, which is always an H1 antagonist, you could end up back in the soup. So we might want to make sure that everybody's educated about, you know, using Benadryl as the sleeper or quetiapine as the sleeper on top of your otherwise low-risk regimen is probably not such a hot idea. I'm going to skip this. This slide just makes a point about energy balance and how easy it is to get a 25-pound weight gain. You know, you basically don't have to do very much. If you eat an extra 125 kilocalories per day, drink a can of Coke at the soda, one extra one every day for the next year, you'll get to about 13, 14 pounds of weight gain. If you sleep a couple hours longer, sit on the couch more, and burn 125 calories less, and have the extra can of Coke per day, you'll be at a 25-pound fat gain over the next year. So it's really not hard to understand how the Zyprexa-treated folks got there. It's more a challenge how to prevent it. Okay, so very quick survey. What do the drugs do to these other things? And, you know, in a way, you could sort of not go into that part of the talk and just say, let's just look at some Framingham data. You know, Johnny Carson, the great, you know, when he projects, you know, the future. This is Framingham data looking at what happens over 10 years, different people in Framingham, Mass, as they increase body weight, depending on whether they were skinny to start with or fatter to start with or somewhere in the middle. So if your BMI is 23 or less, and you gain even 10 kilos, you're really not going to see that many more cases of incident diabetes in the population in the next 10 years. Okay? And it's probably because you have a lot of pancreatic beta cell reserve at that point. But if you're already overweight or obese, and I would suggest that's most of our psychiatric population, already overweight or obese, and then you let them gain 10 or 12 kilos, you're going to see a lot more cases of type 2 diabetes in the next 10 years. So it's really kind of predictable. And these numbers actually came out pretty close to what Bob Rosenheck and Mike Cerniak reported in that national VA analysis. We went ahead and did this large-scale study. We could finally do it after a few years, where there was enough ziprasidone and aripiprazole out there on the market, health core and pharmetrics data, where you could compare it to typicals, look at the hazard ratios for incident diabetes in both a simple cohort, everybody, and an inception cohort. They're starting that drug fresh in that observation period, controlling, unlike a lot of the prior studies, pharmacoepi studies like this, controlling for all the other things that we know cause an increased risk of diabetes, like oral contraceptives and thiazide diuretics and beta blockers, lots of things outside of psychiatry impact risk for diabetes. And what we found, really counter to the FDA's class warning, is that there's really no difference, no statistical difference in the risk for incident diabetes compared to typicals for aripiprazole, ziprasidone, risperidone, or quetiapine. Okay, it's only when you got to olanzapine and clozapine you saw separation from the typicals. Now understand, typicals there is really haloperidol. Okay, that's 99% of the typicals in this data set. So obviously if we made that a chlorpromazine comparison, chlorpromazine would actually look pretty bad. But to me, this was like, it finally helped me to focus. We don't have to get into a dogfight about the difference in weight gain between risperidone and aripiprazole, perhaps. What we want to worry about is the difference in weight gain between those kind of cocktails and these kind of cocktails. And I don't have slides on it, but this is we were talking about the Dan Casey Depakote paper. Okay, so Abbott had funded a study where you're either on monotherapy risperidone or monotherapy Zyprexa, and you got randomized to add Depakote or not add Depakote. And they did a short-term and a long-term study. And basically, there weren't any lasting differences in efficacy when you added the Depakote, but you could make monotherapy risperidone look like olanzapine by adding Depakote, okay, in terms of the weight gain produced at 4 weeks. And you could make olanzapine look worse, by adding Depakote. So, whether it's simple one-level complex polypharmacy, the idea of two different classes of drugs, or true same class polypharmacy. We were talking in the hallway about the idea that some docs will load patients up on high doses of multiple drugs at the beginning of an inpatient hospitalization, and that's a way to deliver a bigger weight gain signal. Olanzapine's weight gain is dose dependent, some of the other drugs' weight gain is dose dependent, so we can minimize or maximize the risk. General principle, the fatter you get, the lower your insulin sensitivity. And it really, in these analyses, didn't matter what drug they were on. Untreated healthy controls, whatever drug, high risk, low risk, it was the fat change that was driving the change in insulin sensitivity. So that's great. It means we can track risk by weighing patients. And like people were saying, if I've got a patient, he's taking olanzapine and he's not gaining weight, looks pretty good. I mean, olanzapine special, I'll still check the lipid profile, but otherwise, I'm sleeping well at night. This is the kid study where over 12 weeks, this is a gold standard measure of insulin sensitivity, highly significant reductions in insulin sensitivity in the pooled groups. I could break it down for you. Olanzapine looks a little worse, but this was a neat study that we did where we had a fancy measure of insulin sensitivity, and we took Eastern European patients. It was the only place we could find. Everybody's on typicals, okay? And then we randomized them to switch to one atypical or another and track the reductions in insulin sensitivity. I don't think that there's something magical. They gained a lot of weight, and the more weight they gained, the greater the reduction in insulin sensitivity. But it did teach me a lesson that quetiapine wasn't this sort of horrible diabetogenic drug. It was one of a series of data points for me that suggested it really wasn't any different than risperidone. I'm not going to go into it, but there is some evidence that there may be effects on metabolic risk that are independent of weight gain or fat mass. And that's the lipid profile comment I make about olanzapine. So not a great body of evidence, but I would check the lipid profile in an olanzapine or clozapine treated person even if they hadn't increased body weight. I mean, we knew in the earliest studies with olanzapine congeners, and even olanzapine in the dog studies, before it ever entered humans, it was producing a lipid signal. Okay, so, I think we should check lipid profiles. I'll skip that one. This is the Katie study just showing how the lipid signal tracks, and there is an important sort of risk management issue here. So in Katie phase 1, randomized to olanzapine, you got a 40 milligram per deciliter increase in your triglyceride. Notice the cholesterol signal's not huge. It's mostly that insulin resistance-related dyslipidemia. But here's something funny and worth commenting on. Remember, quetiapine and risperidone in Katie phase 1 had almost identical weight gain, but they don't have identical triglyceride signals. And this is why we did that study, because so now the hypothesis is quetiapine must be having that triglyceride signal because it's producing more insulin resistance, even though the weight gain seems similar. Maybe it's got a direct hepatic effect, but it doesn't. So what it looks like now is quetiapine, the molecule, has some specific effects on hepatic lipid metabolism. And whether that effect on hepatic lipid metabolism, whether that triglyceride elevation confers the same cardiometabolic risk as a triglyceride elevation that comes as a biomarker for insulin resistance, no one knows that. So I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying, in fact, there's no data to indicate that quetiapine's triglyceride elevation, I mean, we do know it's not because of a big insulin resistance package, and so it begs the question whether you would see the same downstream risk associated with whatever level of triglyceride. And home stretch here, what do we do about this? So the good news is people sort of recognize this, and then they started talking. And we had this consensus conference. I was on the planning committee, and it was to your point earlier, Bob, how do people get these things done? You lock them in the room, and they start to get bored and tired, and they can't go home until they finish, and by gosh, they'll finish that night. So, this went out, and there were recommendations, specific recommendations about monitoring at specific intervals. The only mistake, I thought, was this 5-year follow-up on lipids. That came from NHLBI recommendations for young, healthy humans. Young, healthy, risk-free humans, which is not our population, so that should probably be at least annual. Europeans did it, Australians did it, South America did it. I mean, everybody had some guidance about this. The bad news, we published a series of papers on this. So we started looking at, in HealthCore, Pharmetrics, Medicaid data sets, at what was happening to monitoring rates for glucose and lipids per the recommendations. We can quibble about whether those were the right recommendations, but just as a straw man, were people changing the rate at which they got either a baseline lipid profile or a 12-week lipid profile, glucose, lipids, et cetera, as we spanned these years? When the guidance came out, FDA warnings were in 2003 into early 2004. The APA paper, ADA-APA consensus statement came out in early 2004. And there was no evidence that there was any change in provider behavior. They weren't changing their monitoring rates one bit. This one was Pharmetrics. We did one in HealthCore, same story. And we did one here in a 3-state Medicaid sample. No response whatsoever. It really helps you to... Now, what we published in this paper was docs aren't stupid. They're doing something. They're just not doing what you like. It's hard to herd them. So what they were doing was they were radically changing their prescribing behavior. Olanzapine market share went from about 40% down to about 10%, and they figured that was the way they were going to solve this problem. Unfortunately, as we've seen, because of polypharmacy and other issues, patients even who aren't on olanzapine can get into trouble, so we'd kind of like them to monitor. The children, another plug for the kids here, lipid monitoring rates, even post-guidelines, less than 3% of American children in Pharmetrics were getting, a big managed care database, were getting their lipid profile measured. I mean, I'll sort of wrap it up by talking about one area where we did get traction. This is a 6,000 patient community mental health center network in St. Louis, Barnes Jewish Christian Behavioral Health Network, 4 sites. And what we did was, diffusion of innovation theory, Lean Sigma, Six Sigma, this kind of behavioral change within groups, kind of theory stuff, where we essentially inherited about a 40% monitoring rate, which was what you saw in some populations. I think we saw about 40% on the glucose. We were a little bit better than in Medicaid. So we started out there, and the medical director did a lot of education. We rolled out the message. We're going to set the benchmark now. It's 70% of your patients, not 40, should be getting at least an annual glucose. And then a year later, we're going to move it up to 90% of your patients should be getting at least an annual glucose. And the way it's diffusion of innovation theory beyond just, you told them what you wanted them to do, but then you gave them feedback on how well they were doing. And feedback in this case amounted to making a list that rank ordered the docs, on where, here was the dotted line that was the 70%, and you were personally only monitoring 62% of your patients, or 67, or 82, I think at the outset, the medical director put these lists out, and everybody could see everybody's name. And that just really got people crazy. And then in the service of anonymity and being more respectful, he would send you an email, and it would show my name, and everybody else's name was X'd out. But I could still see where I was on the list, and I could still see I was in the bottom quartile. You know, and I knew that somebody knew where I was. I mean, somebody had seen the list. And docs are intrinsically competitive. So, you know, I was amazed. It moved the numbers so quickly. You know, these are September. It started in January of '06, and here we quickly jumped up. Within like a couple of months, you're up at the threshold. And then when he moves it up to 90, again, it only takes 2-3 months to move it up to the 90% threshold. We had a control clinic that just stayed flat the whole time. It was very interesting. We did do some breakdown of the 4 sites. 3 of the sites had a single medical director always giving a consistent message. 1 of the sites had docs that spent part of their week at that clinic hearing from that medical director, and the other part of the week at the control clinic where they weren't hearing anything. And so they had intermediate results. So it was really an interesting take-home message about, you know, if we want to change behavior, we can do it. You just have to have some teeth. So you guys putting out recommendations, you know, with due respect, I don't think you're likely to have a huge change in outcomes unless you partner with Medicaid, and then there's feedback to the docs and there's actual consequences, and then you can track the outcomes and modify your teaching accordingly. And the conclusions, I think I've said most of those points. Stop there.